Right, this next lesson is focusing on the government policy towards the Native Americans in the years 1835 to 1851. Now, this course is going to develop in terms of showing how the government treated the Native Americans as time went on. Now, at the start of this course, we need to understand that the government took cautious steps to deal with the Native Americans, especially as America began to develop in size in this time period. So firstly, we need to understand the problems that were faced by the US federal government, to look at the consequence of each government policy, and to start looking at how these events link and what impact they have on the Native American life. So looking at the scheme of work, the syllabus that the exam board set, we are looking at this part here: US government policy, support for US westward expansion and the significance of the permanent Indian frontier, and also the Indian Appropriation Act of 1851. You need to have a clear understanding of all those things, and we will develop that in this lesson. So first of all, we need to understand the relationship that the Native Americans had with the federal government. So there's lots of information here just to have an understanding of the role of the US federal government and where the Native Americans fit into this. So what we need to understand first of all is that individual US states were not allowed to negotiate with Native Americans. So the separate states that we have, we just go back, the separate states that we have here, they were not allowed to negotiate to talk to the Native American people. They were the responsibility of the federal government. So the Native Americans were fully under the control and responsibility of the federal government that was headed up by the president. So it was up to that government to deal with the Native Americans, not the state that they lived in. Now, this was good for the Native Americans to a degree, as many state governments were openly hostile towards them. Hostile means angry, didn't want them there. And the state governments were very keen to take their land off them. But the federal government and the Native American relationship was very unequal. The federal government saw the Indians as children that they must look after, who needed to be kept safe and guided towards a civilized way of life. Now, by civilized, we mean probably living like the white settlers, not living the lifestyle that we've seen that the Native Americans live. The government ignored the fact that the Native Indians were in America first and did not give any respect for their belief in nature. Now, what needs to be understood is that the government policy became stricter over time. It was impossible for the government to attempt to move all the Native Americans from the very beginning. Why? Because there were so many of them. There were hundreds of thousands of Native Americans, all in different tribes, sub-tribes, nations, and it was very difficult just to move them. The problem that the government had was that the white settlers were demanding change. As the time went on, more white settlers came to America. As America expanded, more white settlers came, and their biggest fear were the Native Americans. However, this wasn't something that they needed to be scared of. But the white settlers had a different perception of the Native Americans. So if we look here, white Americans believed that Indians were savages who did nothing to improve the land. The reason they thought they were savages is probably because of the act of scalping, which, as I mentioned in previous lessons, wasn't something that happened regularly. White Americans believed they had the right to own land and that they could improve it by farming, turning America into a civilized country. They didn't understand why the Native Americans hunted buffalo. But this was also a way for the white settler to achieve manifest destiny, the idea that all white settlers should own the land of America and turn it into a civilized area. White Americans believe that Indians should all learn to farm or be pushed off their land into smaller pieces of land. So white Americans believed if the Native Americans weren't doing anything for the land, they should be pushed into smaller pieces of land and continued and just rely on the government. obviously we know that being pushed into smaller pieces of land was going to be very difficult for the Native Americans due to their understanding or their practice of being nomadic. All through the 19th century, so all through this course, the US federal government struggled for a solution to the Indian problem. As the number of migrants to the West grew, the US government had two ways to approach them. They could either keep the settlers and the Indians apart or encourage the Indians to become like white settlers. Now, in the short term, number one was done. Okay, but the way in which they did number one was by removing their rights. As this course goes on, and as we get more serious in terms of the conflict, the government start approaching number two, encourage Indians to become like white settlers. Now, encourage is probably the wrong word. As this course goes on, the government force the Native Americans to become like white settlers, which in turn is going to be very problematic for their way of life. So that's the backdrop. What we do need to understand in this course, and this course is very date heavy, we need to understand what the government put in place for the Native Americans and what impact that's going to have in the long run. So what you've got here is the timeline of events from the years 1830 to 1851. Now, because the course starts in 1835, the most important aspects are going to be from the 1840s onwards, but you need to have an understanding of what happened before to be able to understand why it caused such an impact later on. So, in 1830, you had the Indian Removal Act. Now, the Indian Removal Act, as mentioned in 1830, this was signed by President Jackson. And what this did, this was the first time that a group of Native Americans were forced away from where they were living. Now, what needs to be understood is that in 1830, there were Indians living in the east of America. So the Indian Removal Act pressured 46,000 Indians living in the east of America to give up their land in return for new lands west of the Mississippi River. That's key there. Jackson promised they would never have to give up this new land, and it would be known as Indian Territory, Indian land. Now, the government here are making promises that they never kept, especially as America grew. The concept of Indian land was impossible to keep. That's what we need to understand here. The fact that 46,000 Native Americans were forced to move from where they were living, it was the first forced movement of a group of Native Americans. This is the beginning of the federal government trying to keep the natives and the white settlers separate. Now, at this stage, remember, there wasn't many people moving to America. So it must be understood here. At this stage, there weren't many people moving to the West. America was focused in the East. A lot of states had not become part of America yet, being the key term. So we've got the Indian Removal Act. Now, that was the first way of trying to keep the natives and the whites separate. It was also known as the Trail of Tears, and it took some time to complete it. But it was followed up in 1834 by the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act. Now, what this did was it defined Indian territory. It sort of made people have a definition of what Indian territory actually was and what places it included. So the government said that Indian Territory was all part of the US west of the Mississippi, but not the states of Missouri, Louisiana, or Arkansas. So the government said that all that land west of the Mississippi, not including Missouri, Louisiana, and Arkansas, belonged to the Native Americans. Now, this was to keep the whites and the Indians apart. And to do this, the government established a permanent Indian frontier, a permanent Indian border. The government said that whites could not cross the border, settle on the land, and they could not sell any items in this land. The army was going to police the border, and the border also had a chain of forts which were connected by a military road. This was a very definitive attempt to keep the whites and the natives separate. So if we just go back to the map here and I'll just remove what we did on that last page, and I'll just show you here. This being the map 1800, we've got to have an understanding that the territory, the Indian border, was here, west of the Mississippi, but not including Arkansas, Missouri, and Louisiana. So the government were effectively saying west of the Mississippi River, not including those three states, belonged to the Native Americans. That's going to cause huge problems as time goes on, especially as America develops, which by the 1840s, the US began something known as westward expansion. I'm just going to add that into this box here. You had westward expansion. And what that means is that the federal government began to take control of places in the West, or further west than what they were used to. So in 1845, Texas became part of the USA. In 1846, the US gained control over Oregon County, which was previously been shared with Britain. And in 1848, the USA won a war with Mexico, and it gained huge new territories, including California. So let's just take this into consideration. Texas, Oregon, California. Let's go back to this map. Texas, Oregon, and California. If we identify where they are, we're going to notice straight away. California, Texas, Oregon. Where are they? They are in the Indian Territory. This becomes hugely problematic for the government. The fact that the land was gained, the government began to encourage people to move west. How does that work? Especially if the government have said nobody can. Well, because the West is now becoming more economically important, the government want people to move there. So people began traveling west following trails. Now, a trail is a tried and tested route, something that works. For example, the Oregon Trail. And the US government used the army to force the Indians to move away from trails and protect the travelers. So whenever a Native American was near one of the trails, the government would be used to move the Native Americans away. Now, what does this effectively do? Now, the next bit says the frontiers still mark the boundary to Plains Indians' land, but they went back on their promise. By the 1840s, you've got to sort of begin to argue now that Native Americans, even though they had a border, did they have their land? As more people moved to America, the government had to start considering what they could do to keep the Native Americans and the white settlers separate. Which leads to, in 1851, the Indian Appropriation Act. Now, what the Indian Appropriation Act did is it provided government money to pay for moving Indians into Indian territory onto reservations. This was the start of reservations. It was the start of moving Indians within that Indian territory into smaller plots of land to keep them away from the traveling, migrating settlers. Now, some of these Native Americans that were moved into reservations were the same Native Americans who'd been forced to move in 1830 under the Indian Removal Act. Now, in these reservations, there were some hunting lands which were allocated so that they could continue to hunt. However, if their hunting ground was cut off and there were no buffalo, then what was going to happen? Certain groups were going to break these reservations. Other problems with this were that reservations were often far from the tribe's sacred place and the burial grounds of their ancestors. 1851 is the start of something new for the Native Americans. It begins to move them away from their beliefs. It's a problem because they still need to hunt. They still are nomadic. If the government begin extending the reservation system, then the Native American way of life is going to be seriously under threat, which we need to understand. The Indian Appropriation Act was the beginning of a movement that would just grow and grow. As America expanded, reservations also expanded. The plots of land that Native Americans were given were made smaller, but at the start, there was still a lot of freedom for the Native Americans. Don't think that the Native Americans were put into all these reservations overnight. There had to be a range of treaties and understandings. And one of the things we look at later on, the Fort Laramie Treaty, begins to put boundaries on land, so that certain tribes are bound to certain areas. That's also in 1851, but you get a separate lesson on that as it's such a significant topic in this course. So they're the first parts of government intervention. And you must have an understanding of what each one did. So if you make flashcards on these government interventions, the key thing you must understand, though, is what consequences did these events bring. And that will be perfect revision when it comes to the exam.